President, 5 days ago, President Trump made I guess, the boldest defensive policy decision of his presidency to date. He authorized the air strike against the leader of Iran's Quds force, Soleimani, in accordance with his authorities as Commander-in-Chief of the United States under Article 2 of the Constitution. Now, let's remember who Soleimani was. He was a terrorist. He was responsible for training and funding militias across the Middle East, the very militias that have targeted American personnel and our facilities, our partners for decades. He was behind the plot to assassinate the Saudi ambassador in Washington. That was back in 2011. He's been doing this for a long time now. He was responsible for the brutal repression of democratic protests within Iran. The terrorist groups that he armed and trained attacked our partners, including Israel. Some of the people out there are more focused on criticizing President Trump for taking out Soleimani than they are about protecting American diplomats and American troops, conveniently forgetting that Soleimani is the architect of Iran's terrorism and is responsible for over 600 American deaths during the Iraq War. And you stop and you think about how bad he is. It just didn't get any worse than that. We hear a lot about recently getting, I'm very happy that this president was able to put together something to take out al-Baghdadi. But this guy was worse than al-Baghdadi. You could argue even worse than bin Laden. Their justification for criticizing the president for killing a terrorist who wanted to destroy America, stated it many times. They think it was reckless and represents a rush to war. And nothing could be further from the truth. Let's remember how we got where we are today. Remember the Obama apology tour. I remember it well. When he first came into office, he went around talking about all around to our adversaries and our friends alike, talking about how bad America was. And we remember that, and it was a game changer for our behavior throughout the world at that time. So first, American credibility hit an all-time low under the Obama administration. The President Obama set a red line in Syria. We all remember that. The red line in Syria, that was because Syria was using weapons of mass destruction. And he had said, President Obama had said, if you continue to do that, we'll take you out, or words to that effect. Well, then the red line occurred when Syria started dropping weapons of mass destruction on its own people there. Now, that kind of, I think, changed the thinking of what America does and says and what they mean. To make matters worse, Obama signed a deal with Iran that didn't address Iran's support for terrorism at all, and which gave Iran over $100 billion, including $1.7 billion in cash. Now, that was the John Kerry thing. That was when John Kerry was the Secretary of State, and President Obama was the president. And at that time, $1.7 billion was given to this terrorist group in small bills in foreign currency, for obvious reasons. You don't have to stop and think that through. But then, in addition, over $700 billion, and they even admitted at that time that that could be used to expand terrorist activities. One of the quotes in 2016, and I wrote it down, and I've used it many times since then, and I want you to listen to this, Madam President. I think this is a quote from John Kerry in 2016. He said, I think that some of it will end up in the hands of the IRGC or other entities, some of which are labeled terrorists. He also said, I'm still quoting John Kerry, to some degree, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that every component of that can be prevented. So is it any wonder that Iran's regional aggression has only gotten bolder and bolder? Look what's happened just in the last few months. In May of this year, the Iranians attacked oil tankers with landmines. We know about that. In June, they shot down a U.S. drone It's a United States drone. And by the way, the cost of that was classified for a while. It's not classified anymore, except it is in excess of $100 million. That's what they did. What did our president do? He sat back and this didn't cause him to get all excited. And he handled it in a very diplomatic way. Then in September, they attacked the Saudi oil fields, taking some 50% of the Saudi Arabia's oil production capability offline. President Trump showed incredible restraint after each one of these provocations. He responded by increasing pressure on Iran, ramping up economic sanctions, increasing their diplomatic isolation, but not anything that would suggest getting into any type of violence at that time. But the president avoided military action while setting a very clear red line. And what was the red line? He said, so long as you don't kill an American, you kill an American and we're going to come after you. That's the red line. And that's a red line that 95% of the people in America agree with. So on December 27th, Iran crossed that red line. Soleimani directed the attack and killed an American and wounded 4 other service members. President Trump made it clear that there were consequences for spilling American blood. He said, you kill an American, we're going to come after you, and he's dead now. Now, Iran never believed there would be consequences after all. Obama never enforced his red line, and even President Trump was hesitant to use military force. Only a day before the strike that killed Soleimani, Iran's supreme leader tweeted at our president. In fact, you have to read this. This is a tweet that came from the president. That guy was tweeting that we see Iran responsible for the events in Baghdad, and we will respond to Iran. First, you can't do anything. This is the guy telling our president that you can't do anything. And that's a quote. The whole thing is a quote that came from him. They never believed that there would be consequences, but there were consequences. Only a day after the strike, he said, you can't do anything. And we're talking about the Iran's supreme leader tweeting our president of the United States. You can't do anything. Well, obviously, they know better now. Well, President Trump could, and he did. His actions restored America's credibility around the world. He showed that we mean what we say. And you tell me what is reckless. They talk about this is reckless. A president who means what he says and takes protection of American lives seriously, or the fringe Democrats who want to tie the president's hand and deny him the tools to uphold constitutional responsibility to defend its citizens. You know, there is right now before this Senate, there's a resolution, not the one that my friend from Massachusetts was talking about, but another one that would take away a lot of the president's powers of negotiation. We're talking about powers that are there as a result of Article 2 of the Constitution. That's what our president has, those constitutional powers. Yet the president, and he did not use military force until they crossed the red line, and that is not a rush for war. Listen to folks like former Democrat Senator Joe Lieberman. Now, Senator Joe Lieberman, I served here in the Senate with him. He was a Democrat, and I have a quote, one of the quotes that he said just recently analyzing this, and of course, he was in a position, I don't recall, but I think he was here probably more than 30 years. This is a quote from Joe Lieberman, Democrat Joe Lieberman, former senator. Quote, President Trump's order to take out Qasem Soleimani was morally, constitutionally, and strategically correct. It deserves more bipartisan support than the begrudging or negative reactions it has received thus far from my fellow Democrats. That's a quote. And then we had another quote that's about the same time frame, just recently. Listen to, it was Obama's Secretary of Homeland Security. I got to know him. His name was Jay Johnson. He was one who was eminently qualified for that position and did a good job when he was there. But this is what he said about the action with Soleimani that the president is being accused of all these terrible things about from this Secretary of Homeland Security under President Obama, Jay Johnson. He said, quote, he was a lawful military objective and the president, under his constitutional authority as commander-in-chief, had ample domestic legal authority to take him out without an additional congressional authorization, whether he was a terrorist or a general in a military force that was engaged in armed attacks against our people. He was a lawful military objective. Everything was perfectly appropriate that this president did. And these are two prominent Democrats that have come out with this. So, you know, there are a lot of people out there who are pretty fed up with what's been going on. I keep hearing that something's going to happen this week in terms of all the accusations that have been made. And I don't know. I have a personal opinion that a lot of people don't agree with, I'm sure. I don't think even the speaker knows right now just what's going to happen. Are the articles going to come over? I think a lot of her far left friends are saying, yeah, let's go over there and let's continue this thing. Let's continue beating up the president. But she also has a bunch of her liberal friends who are saying, look, the polls don't look too good. People are onto this thing, and they realize that there is a problem. Maybe we shouldn't be sending him at all. We'll find out tomorrow. I understand there's a big Democrat meeting. I'm not invited, but this went over in the House, and they're going to make a determination as to and we'll all find out at that time what's going to happen to the articles of impeachment. Again, a lawful military objective when President Trump took out under Article 2 authority. More to the point, nobody is talking about war. Nobody is calling for an invasion. Nobody is calling for a ramp up. We all know what that looks like here, and it's very plainly not what is happening. An airstrike is not war. Defending America's lives is not war. The president has made it clear that he does not desire war, which is why he has continued to call for negotiations with Iran to end the standoff. And that's the very thing that some people are trying to take away from him. It is not just a constitutional right, it's a constitutional responsibility. So nobody here wants war, but at the same time, nobody should want a policy that would leave Americans vulnerable to the whims of Iran's terrorist-supporting regime. If we do that, if we tie the president's hands so that he cannot defend America's lives, we leave ourselves more vulnerable and therefore make war infinitely more likely. And that's how reckless he is not. So I just would be anxious for this time period to get by so that we don't have to be facing this on a daily basis. And with that, I yield the floor.